Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So hope everyone is doing okay. Let me check my audio. This also is going to be one of those that I'm not going to spend too long on because I have a bunch today. I have a ton of workload today. But it's one of those ones that I wanted to do for last 2 days. I want to do an update on Brexit news, essentially where we are now from the standpoint of Brexit. I know most of the people watch me are an American audience, and I don't necessarily know how close they're paying attention to it, so I try to update it. If it's something that I'm trading over information that the British audience knows, forgive me. I'm going to make my point at the end of explaining where we are. I just want people to have a decent contextual understanding of what's taking place currently, because these are epic things that are taking place across the pond. I tried to explain it to my wife, telling her how epic it is. She was like, it's not epic. No, it is epic, miss. It is epic. You're not going to deny the epicness of this event. Now, the European Union and Britain are separating, or the UK are separating. The question becomes, what is that agreement going to look like? Part of the most recent events that have taken place, I'm not going to go all the way back, but of course there was a Brexit vote. And part of the fight, recent fight, the big fight that has taken place had to do with this idea of a meaningful vote. Look, regardless of what the narrative is in the news, meaning what the position that the politicians are taking, there are a group of politicians that don't want to leave. They don't want to leave. So understand that this is their disposition, regardless of what they say, what comes out of their mouth. This is their disposition. The same thing holds true for the people who want to leave, the Brexiteers. Whatever comes out of their mouth, the disposition is, we want to get out of the European Union. And they have various reasons for doing that. But just understand, from an emotional standpoint, that's their disposition. When they're making arguments, when they're debating, all those things, regardless of how they cut the debate, regardless of what they say in the debate, the end result is, we want to stay. Now, several things are true here. I don't put bad intent on either side on this. I think the Brexiteers, many of these guys are just outright plutocrats, and many of these guys are somewhat disassociated from the negative consequences, especially the short-term consequences that are going to hit Britain when it leaves. And by the way, this is coming from me, who has no ideological bent either for or against Brexit. By the same token, the Remainers, the legislation that these guys are putting out, and what these guys are saying, they may not outwardly say they want a second referendum, but they want to stop this current Brexit. They want to stop it. The big recent vote that came up was on this idea of a meaningful vote. The meaningful vote has to do with this idea of a backstop. If at the end of the vote between Parliament and the EU, meaning the government comes up with its idea, the European Union comes up with its idea of the relationship, and they try to meld that. At the end of that melding, when they come up with a deal, they present it to Parliament, and Parliament gets a choice. Parliament gets a vote. Yay or nay? Do you like what the government came up with the EU or not? If the answer is nay, then their issue was, well, wait a minute. We don't want Theresa May to just be able to take us out of the EU, out of the single market, out of everything. It's just like, fuck, we're done. We don't want them to be able to do that. We don't want you to have that power. We want a meaningful vote on what to do next. Now, they may coat this in the sense of, we want democracy. We want the democratic process. When people decided to leave for Brexit, they didn't know what they were voting for. We want a meaningful vote. However they coat this, understand that their natural base inclination is, we don't want to leave the European Union. We think it will be disastrous if we leave the European Union. So the idea of a meaningful vote is based in this idea of, we don't want to leave. Now, they may be right in saying it may be somewhat disastrous, especially in the short term for Britain to leave. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what they're telling you is all that truthful. I mean, ultimately, they're telling you, no, we don't want a second referendum. Yes, we acknowledge that what the public wanted. We acknowledge all that stuff. But at the end of the day, what they're doing is based in, we think it will be disastrous to leave. And again, no bad intent, just saying their disposition. And this meaningful vote would have given us a chance to stop the government in its tracks if the government decided to leave. They lost that vote. Now, Theresa May faced down her opposition of the Remainers in this camp, but she had to give way. Now, part of the way that she had to give was, if there is a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, then we get a vote. Meaning, no, we don't necessarily get a vote as an absolute at the end of the process if you decide to leave. However, if there's a situation where there is a hard border between those things, we get a vote. Now, the people who were part of the remaining camp didn't necessarily like this. This was unsatisfying to them, but you can understand why it was unsatisfying to them, because again, going back to the regular, supposition, they want to leave. That meaningful vote would have given them a way to stop that process. Here's the catch, though. I binge watched hours of Brexit material yesterday, and I've come to a few conclusions. So one of the things that if you're talking to Veristat, and again, I don't want to get into the weeds because I want to have this for both audiences, but if you're talking to some of the members associated with the EU, they would say, well, look, if you're leaving the EU, then clearly there has to be a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, because we don't want products from another country coming into our country unchecked. Imagine for the moment if the UK says, or the EU says, we don't allow slave labor in our country anymore. We don't allow it. We don't like it. So any tea that is made from slave labor, we don't want it. Say for the moment that the Tory government says, hey, this is just a good deal. We don't see the problem with slave labor for tea, so we're going to allow that to be imported into the UK. Great. You can import it into the UK. Now, how do you prevent that tea from going into the EU? After all, the tea is cheaper than what they would get under normal circumstances, because one person has to pay, the other person doesn't. I mean, after all, they're slaves. You can undercut the prices of tea from the European Union. How do you prevent that? And if you don't have a border, that tea can sail right through. I'm using the tea somewhat as a euphemism for other items that may come into the UK and slide into the European Union through a Northern Ireland, you can call it borderless area. So what the EU is saying here is not necessarily wrong. Now, what the EU has said, however, the position that the EU has taken, and just to give you an idea of the positions that these sides are taking, because it expands beyond Parliament, meaning you have this little mini war that's going on in Parliament itself, but you have an expanded war that's going on in the EU. And the EU's disposition is interesting, and I want to talk about that afterwards. But both of these things are taking place at the exact same time. This is why I said this is fucking fascinating. Britain is under pressure and is almost a vassal state at this point, for the time being, while it goes through this transition of becoming its own thing. But nobody knows what that relationship is going to look like at the end of the process. Nobody knows. What we do know is there have been hits to the British economy. Certain people are being told, or the EU has been telling its people, to not buy parts from the UK, because at that point you're buying stuff from outside of the Union. Meaning there's probably going to be a tariff or some kind of hit on those things if Britain is not allowed to stay in the European Union. Meaning, if they can't come up with a deal, those things are going to have tariffs put on them. Britain is going to take a hit. Britain is already taking a hit. So that's what's taking place in the UK itself. This mini war going on between people who want to remain versus people who want to leave. And Theresa May is stuck in the middle of this particular war. She was able to face down the people who wanted to remain, but again, she had to give a little bit of leeway from the standpoint of if she wants to do a Brexit and have a border with Northern Ireland. Now, here's the catch. Theresa May's position from the standpoint of what the UK is going to look like at the end is nonsensical. But so is Boris Johnson's position. Nonsensical. The Brexiteers' position is nonsensical. The UK's government position on the Northern Ireland border has been essentially called the Narnia proposals, where the EU has says this is nonsense. Neither of those are going to work. Neither one exists currently. They're trying to make this argument that they're going to have technology that can essentially have this magical, invisible border that protects the products and keeps track of the products as they go across. I don't know how this is going to take place. Technology doesn't exist. It's magic. And yet people like Rees-Mogg has pushed for this idea. And Boris Johnson. But again, the basic nature of this, however, is not that they care about the end result. They just want to be out of the European Union. This is what I'm getting at when I'm saying the internal dynamics of the people involved in the process. What they say is important, but it's important within the context of what their disposition is. In the same way that the Remainers want to stay, and the legislation that they're putting up is try to put a hold one line after the next in regards to this kind of preventing Brexit. Well, the Brexiteers just want to get out. And they're making arguments to try to get the public to buy into it's not going to be all that bad and there are other options when we leave. That is farcical. It's nonsense. There may be options when you leave, but let's be honest, there will be a hit. And what they're coming up with as plans for the Northern Ireland border is nonsense. It doesn't exist. Multiple people have told them this doesn't exist. You've had professors who've looked at this and said this is nonsense. This is not going to work. But again, the Brexiteers don't really care. They just want to be out. What their original disposition is extremely important in analyzing what those people are saying in the context of what they're saying. Jeremy Corbyn, in this case, has come up with what I call a nonsensical attack also. Meaning the position of Labour is that, yes, we're going to do Brexit, but we're going to do a soft Brexit. And we're going to remain... Oh, Theresa May's customs partnership. It's also... It's insane. I mean, she's going to talk about collecting all these tariffs and everything else and trying to negotiate all of this stuff as it comes in and out of Britain. Boris Johnson himself has even attacked his own prime minister on this plan. I have to be honest, as much as I loved Corbyn, I can't see his plan as being all that much better. I mean, ultimately, Corbyn is talking about this kind of partnership of sorts. But here's the thing. If you're going to be a part of the single market, you're going to have to follow the rules of the single market. It's not pick and choose. So anybody who's telling you that they can pick this and choose that is not necessarily giving you something that's already on the plate. Now, they can say that this is their negotiating position. Fair enough, but let's be honest. Right now, that's not an option in the lease. So that's where we are in the UK. We're just taking longer than I want. So let's move to the EU. The EU does not want countries leaving the UK. Leaving. If they don't want countries leaving, then they have a vested interest in, to some degree, punishing the country that leaves in order to get across to other countries not to leave. If they make it easy for other countries to leave, then those other countries may leave the moment that stress hits. So the moment that the EU starts putting pressure on these other countries, those countries may also leave, thinking that Britain was able to leave without any consequences. We might be able to do the same. So you can already understand right off the bat that the EU may have a certain disposition of punishing Britain for leaving. And if I'm not mistaken, a poll that was done, many of these people did say that they wanted Britain to be punished for leaving the EU. They don't want them to get any kind of sweetheart deal. The EU has interpreted this from their disposition of, we're a rules-based organization and we must follow the rules. Meaning, if you want to be part of a customs union or a single market, you have to follow the rules. Which means that even though you may be out from the standpoint of Brexit, you will still have regulatory alignment with the EU. That means you haven't left. That's not really Brexit. They're making this argument of rules. Rules. It all boils down to the rules. We got to follow the rules. We're a rules-based organization. We're a rules-based organization. If you want to have any deal with us, this is not pick and choose. Now, the second question becomes, if you're a rules-based organization, does that mean there will be a border on Northern Ireland? From the EU's position, yes. Which you can imagine that's a problem for Britain. These are fascinating politics. Like, will the EU take certain steps to make this deal so shitty that the Parliament will say no to this? If they say no to this, the EU government or the British government has said that they're not putting a border on Northern Ireland. EU has said you must put a border on Northern Ireland. So the question becomes what kind of borders there are going to be. And if there needs to be a border on Northern Ireland, that means the other clause kicks into effect where the Remainers get to have their say. These are amazing politics. These are amazing politics. Part of the reason that the left wing or the right wing wants to do this is because they want to be able to get rid of the rules and regulations that the EU has. And they want to be able to have their own nation state, the kind of bottom basement discount warehouse for corporations and everything else. The left wants to be able to do this because if Jeremy Corbyn is to have his say and have the nation state that he wants, the government that he wants, it will potentially break the rules of the EU. Meaning there's a left-wing argument and a right-wing argument. Both of those arguments boil down to we want sovereignty and control on our own borders and we want to be able to dictate our own fiscal policy. Here's my thing, my spill for this. Brexit means Brexit. You decided to have a referendum. You decided to get the entire country worked up of this referendum or whether or not you're going to leave the European Union. Big politics on an epic scale. And in these big politics, on this epic scale, the public came out and said, we want to leave. We're done. We want to leave. You have a group of Remainers who say, we don't want to leave. And I take them as being earnest in them saying they don't want to leave. And I take them as being earnest on another point that they think, oh my God, this is going to be disastrous for Britain. Take them at their word. I accept what they're saying, that they believe this is going to be disastrous for Britain. The main reason that people left wasn't because of a specific issue per se, even though it is an issue from a meta-narrative thing. It wasn't like them peeling out, well, this guy, we have X number of immigrants coming into the country and we have this taking place. It was more based on this idea of a nation state. We want control over our own borders. We want control over our own fiscal policy. It makes sense to them. And it makes sense to me. The argument had to be cut in a way that would get across to those people that the sovereignty that you're giving up to be a part of the European Union exceeds what you get out of going it alone. They didn't make the argument. They lost that argument. Usually we have representative government where we choose somebody to go and make a choice, and those people make choices based on us in this kind of representative way. Well, this is different. This is, in some degree, direct democracy, where you ask the public, what do you want? What do you want? Tell us what you want. We're putting this up for a vote. And the public, definitively, by a slim margin, said, we want to leave. Whether they knew what that meant or not is besides the point. They understood that it was leaving the European Union. The Remainers, to some degree, are doing a disservice to their government. And I don't say this because I don't see the problems associated with Brexit. I do. I do see the short-term problems associated with Brexit. But I also know that the public said they wanted to leave. What are you going to do? Have a second referendum? And what does that mean for referendums? Or what does that mean for asking what the public wants if you're willing to just countermand what the public wants because you don't like its position? Soros has been outside the country dropping in millions of dollars to attack the referendum to try to get him to stay in the European Union. You've had outside groups. This is a British issue, and you always have outside groups, so the Soros thing, I guess, is neither here nor there. I'm just making the point that Brexit means Brexit. And what is the long-term repercussions for ignoring the referendum, the will of the public? You ask the public something, and you have people who are actively going against what the public wanted and trying to remain in the EU. An unelected body in the House of Lords, in addition to a bunch of people in the Remain camp, who are in Jeremy Corbyn's camp, and who are in the other camp, Theresa May's camp. Look, all I'm saying is Brexit means Brexit. You asked the public something, the public gave you an answer. It's time to get on with it. Theresa May is going to have a conversation with many of the leaders in Brussels coming up. She's admitted that her white paper is not finished. The white paper is supposed to be the document that gives across the British perspective of what a relationship is going to look like afterwards. That paper is not done. Macron is supposedly going to give her a tongue lashing, not in a good way, for essentially not having that particular paper done and for not being further along in Brexit than what they are. Oh, by the way, also, the new news, or the news that just came out, is that the European Union has also sweetened the deal, saying that if you're willing to come away from your red lines and your hard Brexit, we will be able to give you something a little bit better. Meaning, if you soften, we'll soften. Question is, what does that mean? And I don't quite know what that means. I know what it means when they're saying soften or red lines, because keep in mind, I've made the point that from their perspective, what she's talking about is Narnia, this fantasy. So they're making a point, look, if you soften that Narnia policy that you're coming up with in regards to Brexit and the Irish border and everything else, maybe we can come to some arrangement where we can soften ourselves. This is what's taking place currently for Brexit. I hope I did justice in explaining what's taking place. There are other issues that I've went through, like the Northern Ireland issue. Oh, by the way, for those of you saying, why don't they just reunify Ireland? Why not just reunify Ireland? Well, here's the thing. The DUP is the group that Theresa May ends up hitching her wagon to. If you remember, she had a snap election thinking that she was going to be able to break the back of Labour and get majorities that would allow her to push through and enforce her will in Brexit with her iron fist. Theresa May with an iron Thanos glove. Well, that didn't happen. Labour didn't break it all. In fact, Labour did magnificently well. So much so that in order for her government to not collapse, she had to join what George Galloway called a group of hillbillies as a DUP. Essentially, loyalists who were in Ireland who wanted to be so associated with the UK that they refused to leave. Now, from what I understand, the UK government put these people in this area knowing that it was going to create a division and split Ireland, meaning you have the Northern Ireland and you have the Republic of Ireland. So this idea of merging those two is a non-starter. Theresa May's government would collapse on the spot if she ever uttered the words. It's Britain. This is the UK. This is what's taking place right now. It's fucking fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Balthazar, George Soros. Georgia is like the new Jurassic Park films, desperately trying to recreate a long dead era without learning from that era. He's a dinosaur. And Trudy, it's my birthday, so I'm donating to Jamal. Love the show in the audience. 420 all day. Oh, thank you, Trudy, and thank you, Balthazar. It always helps the show. Thank you very much. Look, it keeps the show going in an honest way. This show has expanded from this kind of just nighttime thing to this kind of part-time job of sorts. Almost even part-time at this point for the number of hours I spend on it. So, the help is always appreciated. I hope this gives a decent explanation of what's taking place in the UK. I think I explained it right based on my understanding of events. I mean, granted, you can go further into this idea of the DUP, you can go further into this idea of Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement. The issue with the border is the Good Friday Agreement. This agreement that ceased hostilities between, essentially, the Republic of Ireland and the British government. Putting a border there would break that agreement, which is what the hullabaloo is about. The argument that's taking place from the EU standpoint is rather basic. We're a rules-based organization. We can't allow things to float into the border. So you need to give us a solution to the Northern Ireland border. Otherwise, we need a border there, which the UK finds unacceptable. So these are fascinating politics just across the pond. Just across the pond. So let's see. I'm not going to keep this one long because I thought this one, I think what's taking place over there is amazing. Like, will there be some association between the European Union and Remain factors, whether they're working in tandem consciously or not? Does the European Union have a vested interest in making the deal horrible, in which case it tries to keep British government in the European Union de facto? For the time period that the British government or the UK has not come to an exit agreement, they end up as this kind of almost vassal state, still held to the rules of the UK without necessarily having influence in the political affairs. This stuff gets fascinating. It's utterly fascinating. So I'm going to end this because I have a bunch of other videos that I need to do. But yeah. All right. I have a bunch of other videos that I want to do. So I'm going to end this here. The real issue is Deutsche Bank failure, and that is impending. Nancy Volker. That may be a real issue, but not necessarily for Britain. I mean, it may be an issue for Britain at some point, but right now, Theresa May and the British government is fully occupied with this thing of leaving. They're supposed to be out by 2019. They're trying to put in a backstop that says, if we're not out, what happens? And part of the backstop is we will essentially be a vassal state while we're not out. We're stuck by your laws without any ability to influence those laws. That's the backstop. So you can imagine from the EU standpoint, who cares? But the British government is under pressure from the Remainers and the Brexiteers. And Theresa May is to some degree in the middle of that. You have some people who think she's sabotaging this deal because she doesn't really want to leave. It's not in her. I don't necessarily know if that's true. But nevertheless, we're watching it. We'll see what plays out. Politics on the international awesome scale. So let's see. Grandmaster flash, so they'll make it look like a terrible deal on the surface, but it really won't be. Well, that's the other part, the Remainers. The Remainers want to stay. So you must understand that the way they look at the world and the way they're going to color any event is based in the context of how do we stay. If there's a front in this war that would potentially allow them to stay based on gutting the deal, they're going to gut the deal. My reason for giving you the basic disposition of the people is because you need to understand the context that they're coming from to understand. Because they're not going to say that. They're not going to outright say, we want a second referendum. Because that would mean that democracy doesn't matter. That essentially you keep having referendums until you get the vote that you want. By the same token, would they try to find ways to either to gut that deal? Yes. Of course. Of course. So, I'm going to end it here. Thank you guys for coming and enjoying this. I know for the American audience, this is like, dude, why are you on Brexit? I love covering British politics. I'm fascinated by it. It looks a lot like American politics. They just tend to be, I guess you can say, more earnest, even though I know the people in Britain may not think so. So, I will leave this here. Yeah, I think that's everything. All right, guys. It does sound a lot like American politics. Yeah. Well, with one difference. They're more honest. It's not that I'm saying Theresa May is an honest actor. No, it's just I'm so cynical based on American politics. Like in American politics, Paul Ryan will stand up and say, we're doing this for freedom. And they will pass a tax cut that puts $1.4 trillion tax cuts. Mind you, this is already when 95% of the wealth in America is going to the top 1%. That was under Obama. Europe loves the guy. He gave 95% of the wealth to the top 1%. And what is Trump going to do? Trump just gave $1 trillion tax cut and putting it on the backs of the American workers. When I say that the politics in Britain is a little more honest, that's what I mean. You guys would have never done something so over the top, so shameless, so disgusting, and so repugnant in a time where income inequality is so maxed out. To do something like that, they would do it here. And they would look into the camera saying this is for freedom. And they would try to make this trickle-down argument that the urine that's falling on your head, just like it was in American Pie, is somehow freedom. That's not urine, that's freedom. Honest, you're missing my point, dude. When I say, okay, and maybe this is me saying this wrong. American politics is jaded and full of liars. Both sides, not just one, both. You're stuck in a situation where both sides, very rarely are they honest with you and what they're talking about. Ultimately, they're assiduous to power. We have politics that are governed by the people who are putting money in their pockets. Now, when I say honest, I don't mean honest in the sense of Theresa May gets up and, the stuff that she's saying is straightforward and honest. I don't mean it in that sense, in that literal of a sense. I mean it in the sense that when they're having an argument about the NHS, for example, Theresa May wants to privatize and gut the NHS. Jeremy Corbyn does not. When they're having those fights back and forth, it's clear to see that that's the argument that's taking place. Meaning, if an audience in Britain is looking at that, they can see one party wants to gut the NHS, the other party doesn't. Regardless of what she says out of her mouth, it's clear one party wants to privatize and diminish the NHS. She would say, we've given the NHS X amount, which kind of misses the point of whether or not that's an adequate amount to fund the NHS. I'm making a point to you that that's more straightforward in politics. And you're right, I shouldn't say honest. Honest is the wrong word. Let's say it's clearer to the public. How about that? Let's say it's clearer to the public. Jamal sounds like a bona fide Hillbot. The Trump derangement is strong with this one. Yeah, okay. They're putting kids away, and your response is Trump derangement for people reporting what's actually taking place. Your problem is, Bob, that you voted for the guy. I voted for Jill Stein. The person you voted for is now ripping babies from their mamas. Own that shit because your vote co-signed it. Mine did not. Dodgy Dave and the Panama Papers stayed in office. They dick each other around and lie on the floor. Damien 609, you're right. Again, Damien, you must understand what I mean by this. I'm comparing this to American politics. I'm not comparing this to a thing in and of itself. Yes, Dodgy Dave. In the way what Spencer said it, Dodgy Dave. I agree with you. I don't. The Tories are not to be trusted on this. The Tories are not to be trusted on the NHS or public funding, none of that stuff. But is it unclear to you, if you're a British citizen and you're watching that, Is it unclear to you that they're undermining and cutting the NHS? I'm making the point that in America, it becomes less clear. That's all I'm saying. And maybe I'm wrong on this. I don't live there, so fair enough. I don't live there, so fair enough. I don't trust any of them. I'm cynical of the process in America. And when I look at the EU, maybe through that lens of cynicism, when I look at it, it's clearer to me than if I was maybe living there, who was more acclimated to these guys lying back and forth. So you might be right, Damien. You might be right. All right. So I'm going to... Yeah. Balthazar. Tories rode around on a bus with a lie on it for months rather than honestly discuss the systemic problems with the EU. Yes, Theresa May... Oh, God, you're right. If you remember, Theresa May was riding around with a bus saying all of this money was going to come back. And this dividend she was going to put into the NHS. You're not getting back a dividend. The money that you're going to lose from the standpoint of the economic hit and everything else is going to be greater than any money you're going to get back as a dividend. So Theresa May has to come up with the money from somewhere in order to put into the NHS. Yeah, she rode around with a bus, not telling the truth. They didn't have a substantive debate on this. And you can understand why from a logic standpoint. Me and you are having a fight with sticks. Somewhere along the way, I pick up a rock. What do? Do you pick up a rock also? You pick up a rock also. Somewhere along the way, I pick up a board, a gun, a knife. You almost have to move and vacillate based on what I do, meaning you have to respond. Now, that means that if one party is having a conversation that's not substantive at all, then the other party has one or two things. Either stay with the substantive conversation if they think that can win the day, or somehow move to another conversation that they can somehow get points or score points on an audience. You can see in this line of argument that you slowly move away from the actual substantive conversations that need to take place into what you believe is just the goal is to win. That's all it is. The goal is just to win. I would argue that politics becomes that way, where the main point of Brexit, what's best for the country itself, gets lost into we just need to win. Both sides just need to win. What's best for the American public? Who cares? We just need to win and get in office. Your governments in the UK, and I know what it is. It's not honesty. I know what it is. There's more of a tether to the governments, to the people in the UK than it is the United States. That's what it is. It's not honesty. You're right, Damien. It's not honesty. It's the government can be punished more for what takes place in the UK than it can in the United States. When Theresa May was getting hit with all those scandals, she responded to that stuff. Now, Donald Trump, for the most part, blew off one scandal after the next, not necessarily caring about it. The thing with the kids, however, was the only thing that really stuck. He may have lost things, like when he tried to get rid of the health care of people in the country. I think like millions of people tried to get rid of their health care. They're going to try to get rid of Social Security and Medicare. That's one of the budgets that Republicans passed. But oftentimes the pushback doesn't happen that way. Like, I'm always surprised at the stuff that takes place and there's no pushback. When they found that people were outside in the medical thing, meaning people literally dying outside in ambulances, that was a response. I mean, even in the knife, well, I don't know if the knife stabbings, if there's a response for the knifings. I'm just making a point that there seems to be a closer tether in the politics of the UK than it does in the United States. And it's easier to form parties. The government is slightly different, but I guess I enjoy the politics because the politics seems to be a little bit clearer, if that makes sense. Cameron never thought that Brexit would actually happen. Yeah. Oh, the hubris, Telecrus. Yeah, he never thought it would happen. None of them thought it would happen. Just like they didn't think Trump would get in office. Brexit and Trump are fundamentally the same thing. Trump is a big part of the problem right now. Granted, the Republicans and Democrats gave us Trump, but he is tearing everything down that took 100 years to build. Yes and no, Trudy. I kind of agree with you, kind of don't. I know what you mean. The two parties got us Trump. And I would argue the Democratic Party got us Trump. Republican Party is repugnant. And the only way that they win, however, is if the Democratic Party falls down on the job. The moment that those parties became so close that people couldn't see a huge distinction between those things, you had a candidate who was screaming change that they didn't get from the last candidate that was screaming change in the Democratic Party. And that candidate ends up winning. Now, He's in office. He's putting, in the same way that Obama would put people from Citigroup and in these agencies in a way that were going to enrich themselves with a modest paying attention to government, meaning a modest action of government in relation to how government should act. That's in the best interest of the people themselves. So a housing program is put into effect that's supposed to help people, human beings, and that housing program is not necessarily monitored. Tons of people fall through the cracks and poverty skyrockets. Or you can say wealth disparity skyrockets. That being said, protecting the bankers. You had trillions of dollars that was lost in that last crash. And the idea of protecting the bankers and then putting austerity on the populations in order to protect those bankers, you can understand people will feel some kind of way about that. Trump gets into office, and instead of him putting in intermediaries who are going to enrich themselves from the place of like Wall Street and these places, he puts in the people who gave him money. So Betsy DeVos gets puts into the education department. It's almost like Democrats will put in a middleman in order to screw over the public. Trump puts in the actual people who are screwing over the public themselves. If that's knocking it down, I don't know if that's knocking it down, but it's definitely shining a spotlight on the problems associated with it. My problem is that he didn't build this. He may be using it, but he didn't build it. Let's be honest. Like the idea that he's knocking down all of these pillars that are created in America. Trump didn't build this stuff. The focus that is on Trump right now is just because of how gross and over the top Trump is. The immigration issue was already here. He made it worse. He's disappearing all of these kids, and that's a problem in and of itself. But the edifice was there prior. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. The tax cuts. Hillary Clinton was going to give a tax cut if she got in. Again, Democrats would not have cared one iota. Hillary Clinton was telling people that leave. It was talking about, these people need to go home, and we can't necessarily allow these people to come into the country because it creates a bad precedent. I'm just trying to make the point, Trudy, that the disparity between Democrats and Republicans is not this wide gulf. Trump is bad in rhetoric, but if any other Republican got in office, would they be doing similar, if not the same thing? I gotta say yeah. They probably would. You probably would. Political elites don't give a flying fuck about you. The same corporate masters. Right there. They don't. So stop caring about them. Like they've waged a class war on you for the past 50, 60 years. I can argue going all the way back to the 20s and before. Stop defending them. This kind of weird false consciousness where people will make arguments for their plutocratic lords. It's so fucking weird. So weird. I think Trudy is speaking about the deregulation, especially Sherry, I don't fully disagree with her. I don't disagree with Trudy. I guess not fully. Maybe I take a finer line to it. It's not a full, complete agreement. It's yes, Trump is hazardous. Trump is horrendous. Trump is completely repugnant in that office. Trump is an honest representation of what America is. That's what he is. My point is that the deregulation didn't start with Trump. The tax cuts didn't start with Trump. The breaking families didn't start with Trump. None of that stuff started with Trump. All of a sudden, everybody wants to pay attention to it because Trump is so gross and over the top. But let's be clear that this stuff also was in Democratic presidencies. The only difference is they talked about it in a different way. That's all I'm saying. But Trudy, I don't disagree with you. Lord of Chaos, if we ever came together as a population against the bankers, we would win easily. That's why my channel is this way. I try to look at it and say there are 20-30% of people who are reachable. And calling them racist and sexist and all this other stuff without necessarily being attentive to their issues. There is a far left and a far right contingent that have agreement that can come together to create a new fulcrum in our society. Anti-war, anti-drug war. We may bump heads on some issues like the immigration thing, but the difference is you can come to some level of agreement with that group as opposed to the radical center who doesn't necessarily want to change the way status quo is. So yeah, Sherry Specter, that's right. And destroying medical care, headed for what they call entitlements next. Trudy, I agree with you. Look, I don't disagree with you. Donald, whatever Trump said during the election, I don't know why people believed it. If I'm being honest, that's wrong. People believed it because they've been so let down by establishment forces that this other guy comes in and he says something different. So I get why they believed it. He's running as a Republican, which means, again, even though I understand why they would want to believe it, I have no idea why they would believe somebody running as a Republican would increase minimum wage, would get them big, beautiful health care. I don't understand why they would believe it, but they did. They're going after Social Security, Medicare. They've already, if I'm not mistaken, in some of these places, putting like work requirements on this stuff, child credits, food stamps. And mind you, they're doing this in order to pay for the tax cuts they gave to the top 1% and 0.1%. So Trudy, I don't disagree with you. The cutting and destroying the EPA, the destruction of any kind of regulation, even not fighting for Obamacare in courts as these states bring trials against them. Usually presidents, even Republican presidents, just by virtue of the office itself, would fight for the law. And if the law is Obamacare, they would fight to uphold that. Well, Trump has decided not to. Yeah, he's knocking down all of these things that were put in place. These things were modest, however. And I'm making a point that these things were already in the process of being knocked down. I don't like it, Trudy. So don't misunderstand me. I just want to add a little bit more context to it. I don't like this narrative that Trump came in office and everything fell off of a cliff. I want to make the point that we were already in the process of falling off of a cliff when Trump just made it that much worse. I hope that makes sense. Republicans are terrible. Most right-wingers I talk to aren't completely gonzo. Right. They're still poor people and know what they need. They just have to fight the Fox box for their brain. Yeah, they need to fight the Fox box, but we also need to give them something. They need something. Donald Trump said he was going to increase the minimum wage. He was going to get big, beautiful health care. Think about this. Trump is coming out saying this stuff, and these people are cheering him on, and they're all for it. If Donald Trump came out tomorrow and said, look, I'm going to do a medical care for all, Republicans will be against it. But do you honestly believe his base will be against it? I don't think so. In this case, the problem is not necessarily fully the policy. The problem is the person who's giving out that policy and whether or not they believe what they're putting out. And I would argue, and I know Republicans hate it when I say this, some of this has to do with race. If you as a party, and this is not just in the United States, I've been binging on content from other countries for the past week. Germany, Britain, some of the issues that are taking place in regards to the immigration issues wrecking the German government. And it's not fully even just immigration, but I'm just saying the immigration issues that are racking the European Union. I'm fascinated by it. Some of the immigration has to do with Romania, where people would bash Romanians. In other cases, people used to bash the Irish. It's not fully this thing on race. Sometimes it's also this thing on culture. It's just so bizarre in the way that we create these distinctions and use these distinctions as ways to say, I'm better than you, or these people are somehow hanger-ons to our system. So it's not purely just by this thing of race. But in the United States, the thing is race. Part of the problem of emphasizing race is that race is emphasized. It is not bad in the least for the Democratic Party that have taken on African Americans during the 60s and 70s and so forth to bring them into the party and to pull up politics. It was necessary. It was the right thing to do. Civil rights, voting rights, all those things were the right thing to do. You've extended freedom for some in the society. Now, others in the society say we're losing our rights, but the rights that they're talking about is the right to subjugate others. Meaning, a positive right for them is a negative right for everybody else, or at the very least people of this particular skin color. So I make the argument it was a good thing of what Democrats did when they hug identity in this way. Here's the problem. There are consequences when the hugging of identity is not paired with also an understanding of economic realities. You're hugging identity. That's great for those identities. But what about people who are not part of those identities? Let's stop pretending as if people are altruistic or completely altruistic in a capitalistic society where everybody is fighting for resources. You've hugged identity in order to obfuscate from dealing with economic realities. Meaning, the identity that you hug creates the disparity between one group or races, black, Hispanic, LGBTQ, and whites. And you can see the disparity in the way that votes are taken. It's not necessarily Democrats' fault. Republicans have also ran with this idea of people who are least likely to care that the money that is being raised in the country and the resources are going towards the 1%. They have their own special issues. They may be religious maniacs, they may be racist, they may be all sorts of stuff. But this idea of you're being fucked over and the money that's going to these Republicans are essentially being used as an investment for them to give more money and tax breaks and policy breaks to the top 1%. Those people don't fully care about that. They care about other issues. So you see this disparity in the way that the population votes. It's odd, and it's in no way a beneficial disparity. I argue that part of the reason that disparity has taken place is because of the hugging of identity without necessarily pairing it with economic gains. Meaning you haven't really given anything to somebody who's not part of that identity. Hugging the identity makes those identities feel good. But ultimately, part of the problem with African Americans, Hispanics, and even labor has to do with resources. You've given 95% of the wealth to the top 1%. Now, hugging identity is great, but that just means you're a decent person from the standpoint of not being racist. Congratulations. Can we get a little bit beyond, protection of these demographics? Economics is what matters. And you don't necessarily have to say I'm one or the other. You need to be both. Martin Luther King was both. They sanitized his image, getting rid of the socialists and anti-imperialists, and instead just make him this kind of peacenik as opposed to this revolutionary that he was. Until you deal with economic realities, that 30% is either going to flip back and forth or you're just going to lose them out of the political process. Just saying. All right, I'm going to end this here. Let's see. Balthazar and Trudy, again, thank you very much. And Trudy, happy birthday. Happy birthday. All right, guys, I'm going to end this. I have another one coming up in like 10 minutes. Like I said, I have a lot of these. This one lasted longer than I wanted, but whatever. It's still a good conversation to have. Thanks, guys. I'll see you shortly. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. And of course, you can always support through PayPal, Patreon, or Super Chat. Thanks, everyone.